Good morning, Mr. Graves. Thank you for returning to give further evidence to the inquiry. May I remind you that you're still subject to the affirmation that you gave on the first occasion?
Yes, I do understand.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Graves.
Morning.
You have helped us before, and you came to the inquiry on Friday the 25th and Monday the 28th of November 2022.
Yes, that's correct.
And at that earlier hearing, I asked you quite a number of questions about your career, and we discussed your CV, and that evidence remains available to the chair to consider. But just as a very minor recap, if I may, for those listening in the room and elsewhere, you told us in November 2022 that you were formerly with the Metropolitan Police Service from 1982 until your retirement in September 2012.
That's correct.
And you had acted during that time as an inspector, but your rank for the last 15 years of your service was as a sergeant.
That's correct, yes.
And you explained to us during that evidence that you'd originally been asked to write a report for the Crown Office.
That's correct, yes.
And that was in connection with the events at Hayfield Road in 2015.
Yes.
And I won't put these on the screen, but you provided the inquiry with a statement at that time that was taken over a couple of days and was signed on the 16th of November 2022.
That's correct, yes.
And we discussed that in some detail at the previous hearing. And we also looked at that time at your original letter of instruction that the Crown had sent you and your report on the use of force by the police in relation to the restraint of Mr. Bio in 2015.
Yes, that's correct.
And that report was dated the 13th of April 2018.
Yes, that'll be right.
And for anyone who wishes to refresh their memory in relation to your evidence at that hearing, that remains available on the YouTube channel and via our website.
That's correct, yes.
But you've agreed today to return to assist us, but the focus today relates to police training and in particular officer safety training.
Yes.
And we're looking at training today, not primarily the events at Hayfield Road. You've already told us your position on that.
Yes.
So just briefly to look at your experience as a trainer, you did discuss this at the previous hearing. You talked about delivering training on behalf of the College of Policing,
yes,
based in England. You've delivered training externally to police forces and police services, to immigration and border force officers.
Yes.
You became an associate lecturer with the College of Policing when you retired from the Met in 2012.
That's correct.
You've assisted with developing training packages and training processes around personal safety, both in the UK and also abroad, with police services such as Sierra Leone, Saudi Arabia and Ghana.
That's correct, yes. Some of those on behalf of the College of Policing.
And you built on your experience and the work you did with the Met in your role there as head of training. And so as the years beyond your retirement, you continue to build on that with the College of Policing.
That's correct, yes.
And I think at the time you were giving evidence, you said you were now effectively an employee of College of Policing. Does that remain the position today?
Not any further, no. I sort of removed myself from the College of Policing list about a year and a half ago.
Right. And you have given evidence on a number of occasions in relation, obviously, to the public inquiry, but also in relation to other cases.
Yes, many court cases, inquests and various tribunals and misconduct hearings.
You also told us that at national level you'd been appointed secretary to the Association of Chief Police Officer Practitioners Advisory Group on Personal Safety in April 2000, and that was part of the Self-Defence Arrest and Restraint Subcommittee under the Firearms and Conflict Management.
That's correct. I was secretary from 2000 until my retirement in 2012.
And that role included the management of the National Personal Safety Manual, which you fully reviewed and continually updated with the latest version, which was launched in February 2012.
That was the last one I had involvement
That's
in,
the
yes.
last one. And if we hear you refer to the NPS manual or the NPSM, that is the manual that you're referring to, is that right?
Yes.
An up-to-date version of that.
Yes.
And my understanding from your statement is, and your recent report, is that that manual, which is for forces in England,
England, Wales and Northern Ireland, yes.
Wales, North, is over 4,500 pages long.
Yes.
So it's a substantial document.
Yes.
And the closest equivalent would be in Police Scotland would be the OST manual, or the Officer Safety Training Manual.
That's correct, yes.
And your report primarily has focused very much, initially at least, on the OST manual, which was in force at the time in 2015, which was the 2013 OST manual.
That's correct, yes.
And that is dated September 2013.
Yes.
And I think you explained in your previous evidence that the NPS manual, the National Personal Safety Manual, through College of Policing, covers everything, personal safety skills, including skills for firearms officers, mounted officers, and all sorts of techniques that we will be discussing today.
Yes, it has over 15 sections reverting to virtually the use of personal safety skills across the broad scope of policing.
Thank you. And as part of the task which you've carried out for the inquiry, you have compared Police Scotland's training in 2015 with College of Policing training that was available also.
That's correct,
in
yes, at the
2015.
time, and also up to date now.
Thank you. Could we look at your letter of instruction from the inquiry, 29th September 2023, which is WIT 00065. And do we see here, this is a letter, you see the date, 29th September 2023, and it asks you for an expert report police training. And if we go down that page, on page 1, the inquiry wrote this letter giving you, again, some background and context, of which you would have been aware anyway from your previous involvement, and explained, if we can move on to the next page, I think we see a section that says instructions. Here we are. The inquiry's terms of reference require it to establish any defects in training which contributed to the death, and to make recommendations covering improvements to training which might realistically prevent other deaths in similar circumstances. So it was explained to you what the terms of reference
Yes,
were.
I understood those, yes.
And then we said, as such, the chair to the inquiry will require to determine whether the officer's training was defective, and if so, whether those defects contributed to Mr. Bio's death. In the event that he answers both questions in the affirmative, he will require to make recommendations in relation to training aimed at preventing deaths in similar circumstances in the future.
Yes.
And so it was explained to you that the focus was to be on highlighting defects
Yes.
or failings of some description that may have contributed to the death of Mr. Bio, and that it was explained to you that the chair may require to make recommendations in the future.
Yes, I understood that, yes.
And if we can just very briefly look at the end of the report, we should see sorry. I'll come back to that in a moment. In addition to the letter of instruction, you were also sent a number of documents.
Yes, a large number of documents, yes.
And as well as looking at those documents which were provided by the inquiry, you also provided documents which you had access to, largely from College of Policing.
Yes, as reference documents for comparison, yes.
And you provided those subsequently as an appendix to your later report.
That's correct, yes.
And we'll leave that letter of instruction now, and I'd like to look at your actual report. This is SBPI 00667. You'll see that's dated, your name is at the top. The date is the 19th of August this year.
That's correct, yes.
And if we can move down the page, please. It says expert review, police training in relation to personal safety, Police Scotland, and it's a report from Mr. Martin Graves. And this is your report.
It is, yes.
And as part of your work, did you consider the documents we had sent
I did, yes.
and the documents which you provided to us?
I did, yes.
And your letter of instruction?
Yes.
And did you do your best to be accurate and truthful in every part of your
I have, yes,
report?
to assist the chair, yes.
Thank you. If we can move down to page, we've seen page 1. Before we go to the body of the report, you'll see the contents coming up there. Can we look at page 30, which is at the end? You've signed that, although our version is redacted.
Yep.
And if we could look at, if we could just move up the page slightly, there we are. And there's a statement of truth at section 8.
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
I confirm that I have made clear which facts and matters referred to in this report are within my own knowledge and which are not. Those that are within my own knowledge I confirm to be true. The opinions I have expressed represent my true and complete professional opinions on the matter to which they refer. This report, consisting of 29 pages, each signed by me, is true to the best of my knowledge and belief, and I make it knowing that it is tendered. If it is tendered in evidence, I shall be liable to prosecution if I have wilfully stated in it anything which I know to be false or do not believe to be true.
That's correct, yes.
But you've
Standard declaration, yeah.
endeavoured not to.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Thank you. And as we go through your evidence today, Mr. Graves, if there's anything that you see that you'd wish to change or amend, you can please let us know so that the chair can be
I will do,
alert
yes.
to that. I'd like to go back to the body of the report, please. And we'll see the contents on page 2. There we are. You've detailed there the instructions, the documents you reviewed, the comments, observations and opinions, specific questions posed, and a summary of conclusions, and thereafter your appendices showing your literature and such.
Yes, that's correct.
And then we can move on to the next page, please. And here we have, you have summarised your instructions here,
Yes.
which we looked at briefly. Could we look at B? You've identified specific instructions to review the documentation and arrive at a conclusion. And specifically, you've focused on defects and inaccuracies in the training and supporting documentation. And I have broken my review down into the following areas. You've got 7 areas here, and that includes the OST training programme that was in existence at the relevant time.
Yes, that's correct.
May 2015. Defects in that training, and that covers all sorts of defects in content, delivery, policy, supervision.
Yes, because
such like.
it's not just about what actually is in the manual, it's about how it's delivered and the supporting processes around that.
Thank you. Any inconsistencies or differences between the training provided in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom?
Yes, that was the comparison with the MPCC manual.
And that's based on your own personal, professional experience and teaching experience in England, Wales and Northern Ireland?
It is, yes.
the OST training programme currently being delivered by Police Scotland?
Yes.
So you've also looked at the position, and when it says currently being delivered, I would like to point out that's from 2022.
Yeah, the documents that were produced were they were the latest documents produced.
And we have heard from other witnesses that Police Scotland continue to develop their training and improve their training, and that continues to evolve on a regular basis.
Yes,
But the documents you had were from 2022.
that's correct, yes.
Next, any defects in that training by way of content delivery, policy, supervision or monitoring. So again, you've looked at a wider picture, not simply at what's written down in a manual.
Yes,
And any inconsistencies or differences between the training provided in Scotland, that's in 2022,
Yeah.
and the rest of the UK. And then how any such defects or inconsistencies might have affected the performance of a hypothetical reasonable officer.
yes,
Thank you. And we looked at that hypothetical reasonable officer, I think, in your last evidence.
yes,
Where we talked about a police, and we'll come back to this at a later stage, but where an officer who is acting within his legal requirements, his ethical requirements, and doing things as he's been trained to do.
yeah, as expected from that officer based on the training and the requirements.
And I think at your last evidence, you made it clear that there may not be just one option for a hypothetical reasonable officer.
No,
There may be a range of reasonable options
Yes.
for that officer to adopt.
yeah,
And you've maintained that in your mind throughout preparing your report.
yes. It's about if the officer's provided with the variety of options available to them, it's for them to decide and choose the option that best fits the situation that they're facing.
So two officers could do different things, but they could both be reasonable in the circumstances.
Yes.
Thank you. And then if we could turn to page 4, please, and look at section 3. And I'd like to spend some time looking at section 3. And this is where you give your views, and it says at 3A, any OST, Officer Safety Training Programme, must contain the following elements for it to be fit for purpose.
Yes.
And can you explain to those listening, what does it mean for something to be fit for purpose?
There are a number, as I said earlier, there are a number of requirements for any training program to not just be delivered, but to be capable of equipping the individual to face the difficulties that they may face. So it's not just about having a list of content. It's about how that content is delivered, how that content is measured against the individual, how does the individual show their competency and the fact that they have actually achieved the required standard expected of them. And also that there's then a process in place not only to monitor the individuals, but also to monitor, develop and refresh the persons responsible for the delivery of that training. So it's a holistic approach to the training content, and as you touched on regarding Police Scotland now, that continual review and continual updating of the programme and changing it for as things requirements come in, such as legal requirements, tactical requirements, or medical information is improved, so that can adapt and it can grow and change rather than just being a one-size-fits-all type of solution.
And is there a difference between best practice when it comes to training or something being fit for purpose?
There will always be a requirement and a proviso on any programme with regards to other constraints upon the individual or the organisation. They could be time constraints, they could be financial constraints. But for a fit-for-purpose programme, that doesn't really change the fact of the content and the processes must be in place. And if they're not in place, that programme is unlikely to meet the needs of either the organisation or the individuals it's designed to assist.
Thank you. Let's look at these 7 points, because I intend to ask you questions about going through each of these. The first is an agreed and documented content. What does that mean?
Yes, I mean, basically, most manuals these days, certainly the UK-based manual, is considered a menu of options. So it has a number of different types of techniques and information. Some of it is quite stringent and required, things like communication skills, conflict management, use of force. Obviously, they're all standard components of a documented content. However, when we come to physical skills, these can vary in relation to the type of equipment that a particular service or force have chosen. Their policing requirements may be slightly different to other forces. You know, if a force is particularly rural, they may have slightly different requirements than a force that is predominantly an urban-based force. So the selection of the content and the techniques that those officers receive is a matter for that force to decide from that menu of options. But in principle, they will always have a section on unarmed defensive tactics. They will always have a section on baton use, handcuff, irritant or incapacitant sprays, restraints, and any other equipment like fast straps and things like that that they may have their officers carry.
Number 2 is a methodology for delivery with set competencies to measure against.
So as I say, how do you check that the individual has achieved or has taken on board the information and can demonstrate the techniques that you're asking them to take on board? So a set of competencies around the physical skills definitely is a must, and also a manner or a methodology of being able to test that the knowledge that they've been given around conflict management, etc., has gone in. That could be something as simple as a written test or a knowledge check, but some competencies can only be checked by actually physically seeing an individual demonstrate those, especially when we look at behavioural requirements such as conflict management. That can really only be shown in a scenario-based environment.
3, a recognised level of trainer competence to deliver the programme.
As I say, the trainer is an important part of the process, an important part of the holistic approach. They should be trained to a recognised level, and that's not just teaching qualifications, but that's also skill levels. They should be regularly updated, and there should be a process in place for them to be refreshed and competency checked themselves, so that what they're delivering, we can confirm that what they're delivering is the required standard.
And then 4, a process of check testing and developing the trainers.
Yes, as I've just said, some process in place where they're either annually or biannually brought in or visited, monitored, assessed, etc., and given fresh information or any changes to the programme that have taken place.
So 3 is about making sure they're at a basic level of competence, a standard level.
Yeah, so that would be a creation of a trainer's course that equips them to go out and be able to deliver that programme.
And the check testing and developing allows them to progress.
Yes.
As time moves on.
Yeah, and it also produces for want of a better terminology, an MOT process for their skill level to make sure that they're of the required standard going forward.
So a means of ensuring that they maintain those standards.
That's correct, yes.
Long term. 5, a method of monitoring delivery.
Yes, so that's either having somebody at a local level who is responsible for monitoring and checking local delivery for officers, or a process whereby a central unit may go out and monitor the delivery of the training at various locations. Most services or forces use what we call a cascade system, whereby there's a central unit Certainly within the MPS and in a lot of other large forces, there is a central team that have part of their responsibility is to go out and visit those venues, make sure that the venues are suitable, make sure that the trainers are delivering the content, the programme, and that they're delivering it in the relevant fashion and with the correct supporting information.
So delivering at a local level, that's dealing with officers face to face in the local areas.
Yes,
is it?
that's sort of usually local officers who have become trainers, training staff from the area where they're based.
And monitoring that to ensure again that standards are maintained.
Yes, yes. So that may be the fact that there's, you know, a small team at one particular area, one person, maybe a supervisor, is allocated that task to look after them, or it may be the case that somebody from the central, as I've said, comes out and monitors the whole group at the local level.
And that's monitoring both in terms of the content is being appropriately shared, but also the demonstrations and skills are being
Yes, is the programme being delivered as it's expected? Is it being delivered to the correct level? Are they using the correct methodology to deliver that? And are they you know, basically performing to the level that's required?
6, systems to review and develop the programme with access to independent sources of information and expertise.
Yes, this is the only way that you can really develop, certainly an officer safety programme, is by using intelligence-led information that is accessed within the organisation. So that includes things like complaints, injuries, assault figures, use of force figures. So that's where an officer uses force and they record that use of force on a particular system or form. That should be reviewed to see what officers are actually using and what they may be using or not using or is becoming ineffective. Also then using external sources such as other organisations, other forces, liaising with external expertise, so that's medical. So you may want to review medically something that you're considering including or adding to your programme. Legal services in relation to findings from situations like this, coroner's inquiries and things like that. So it's having access to all of that information, which will much better allow you to develop and change and modify the programme going forward.
Thank you. And then finally, number 7, someone responsible for oversight, both day-to-day and strategically.
Yes, as I sort of touched on, somebody within the organisation, either at a central level or someone within the training world, possibly the central training school, who has direct responsibility for this OST delivery. But on top of that, also somebody within the senior management, the strategic management of the service, who is the champion or the person who that individual can go to say, you know, we have a problem, or this needs to be looked at, or this needs to be pushed forward. Without that strategic lead, obviously, officer safety programs can drop down the importance ladder, unfortunately, with other requirements within the police service. So it's important to not only have somebody looking at it at sort of grassroots, but also somebody at a strategic level who has that direct access to the senior management of the service.
And it sounds like a training programme such as you've described, which perhaps fits all these criteria, would be evolving on a regular basis.
Yes, I would expect sort of ongoing, certainly on at least an annual basis, some form of review being taken place, depending on the methodology of development for the officers. So if, say, for example, it was a biannual, so they were doing it twice a year, each of those packages can be looked at and changed as required going forward. If it's an annual, then you've got a little bit more time to utilise more information for that one session, as I say, depending on how the refresher programme is delivered within that organisation.
Thank you very much. Now, in pages 4 to 11 of your report, you cover each of these points, and what I plan to do is go through a number of the paragraphs where you deal with them in turn. But can I ask you, first of all, you've identified these 7 criteria. How did you learn about these criteria yourself? Is this part of your professional work as a trainer?
Yes, certainly. I mean, that all of those 7 requirements were in force within the MPS when I was there, and are still in force now. I'm aware of those 7 elements being in position for the majority of forces up and down the country when I was responsible for monitoring and overseeing training.
And you were head of training at the Met.
I was, yes.
And left in 2012.
Yes. I was head of training until 2010, and then my role evolved and I became the subject matter expert in relation to the programme and the policy and equipment, and the training was separated out and went to another supervisor.
All right, thank you. But those criteria were known to you as early as 2012?
Yes, I from 2000, there was a programme in place, but I changed and developed the programme quite extensively over the first sort of 3 or 4 years of my time within the department.
Thank you very much. Let's deal with the first one then, an agreed and documented content. So let's look at that. Let's turn to section 3B of your report. So you'll see that this is on page 4, and we see at the top of the screen. The only apparent agreed programme in place in 2015, and this is for Police Scotland,
Yes.
was that of the student officer package being delivered centrally. Although this was seen as the main package, the inquiry has heard evidence from Inspector Young and others that this was not the case, and some legacy programme content was still being delivered across the force area. And you refer there to the National OST Review and Evaluation, April 2015, called the 2015 OST Review Report. Now, we will come on to that report. We've heard evidence that it was Inspector Young who began to do a review of training with Police Scotland in December of 2014.
Yes, that's correct.
So we've heard that Police Scotland came into existence on the 1st of April 2013, and Inspector Young was involved in training, and from December 2014 started the process of a review. And that's what you've called it, the 2015 OST Review Report.
That's one of the documents, yes.
But looking at the issue of an agreed and documented content, you say here, your understanding is that the only apparent agreed programme in place in 2015 was the student officer package being delivered centrally. Now, can I ask you, we've heard reference in evidence to something we've been calling the 2013 manual.
Yes.
Can we look at PS 10938, please? And you see there, it says created September 2013 towards the bottom left.
Yes.
And the yellow band on the right-hand side does make it clear it's a student training manual.
That's correct, yes.
And we've heard that this was provided to all probationers from that date, and also to all instructors, training instructors.
Yes.
From that date. And we've heard evidence from Inspector Young that the refresher training ought to have been on the basis of this document for
Yes.
those officers who weren't probationers, weren't trainers, but who were attending refresher training.
Yes, and as I said, it's a manual designed for new officers, and one thing it doesn't really address is the fact that new officers' requirements are slightly different from serving officers' requirements. You're teaching a skill, a new skill in the first instance. You're replenishing or refreshing the skill for an officer that already knows how to do it. So it's a bit like a driving check test. So if you drive, you can pick up bad habits. Therefore, the check testing of that driver is requirements. OST package should be very similar. We should have an initial probationary or a student officer program, and then based on that, quite rightly, as Inspector Young has stated, based on that should be a refresher program, but it shouldn't be identical to the student officer program because they have different needs.
And we've heard evidence that probationers, new recruits will attend Tullyallen and be trained for a number of weeks. But refresher training, at least in 2015 or up to that period, was a day.
Yes, 1 day.
And we, as I say, we've heard from Inspector Young that a copy of this manual would have been provided to all probationer officers on the commencement of training at Tullyallen,
Yes,
and all OST instructors from the 1st of September 2013.
yeah. So any officer trained at the school from 2013 onwards should have had access to this, or anybody that's had been refreshed should have had the content from this manual.
And certainly Inspector Young's evidence was to the effect that all training and recertification training ought to have been done under the manual.
Yes,
So this would have been the core document for training from the 1st of September 2013.
it should have been, yes. It's the only one that's been produced.
Right. But as you note in paragraph B in your report, evidence has been given by Inspector Young that some legacy programme content was still being delivered across the force area. And when he referred to legacy programme content, he was talking about what we've come to know as legacy forces, which existed before Police Scotland came into being.
Yeah, that's correct.
So that would have been Fife Police, Lothian and Borders Police,
Strathclyde,
different
yeah.
areas. They were known as legacy forces.
Yes.
And they had their own views on training.
And different equipment. So as I stated before, they were all carrying different types of equipment. They were all running slightly different programs. Some of them had different content or additional content that the other legacy forces did not. And that was evident from the 2015 review that those practices had continued, even though there was now allegedly a central reference document, i.e. this manual.
And the Chair has Inspector Young's evidence on that. But it would appear that in terms of the content and the materials used by legacy forces, that would have differed depending on which force you were looking at.
Yes.
But then from the 1st of April 2013, Police Scotland came into being.
Yes.
But some of that content, some of those materials continued to be in use after the 1st of April 2013.
It certainly appears to have been, yes, based on Inspector Young's testimony and my review of the documentation.
Thank you. Let's look down to Module 1, please. So this document, I think, we only see a page at a time, but it's about 196 pages in length. If you stop there, please. And we can see here that the manual is broken up into things called modules.
Yes.
And there are 14 of them, I think. Module 1, which we see on the screen, is officer safety training. And you'll see 14 sections, 1 to 14, within that module.
Yes.
And they each deal with different topics.
Yes.
All under the heading of officer safety training.
Yes.
And then there are other modules. Module 2 is empty hand techniques.
Yeah. It goes on to the physical techniques and the physical skills after that first section.
Module 3 is the rigid handcuffs, and it goes on from there. But let's stick with the first section, the first module, if we may. And we've looked at Module 1 with a number of witnesses in the inquiry. And I think the first aspect that you mention this is back to your report, 3E. If we can go back to page 4 of your report for the moment. So that's SBPI 00667. And with page 4. and it's paragraph E. So this is section 3E. Here we are. The first and major point to raise with the 2013 OST manual, that's the manual we've just been looking at on
That's
the screen,
correct, yes.
is in relation to the layout and emphasis in Module 1. Firstly, the model that everything should hang from or support, the National Decision Model, we've also heard that called the National Decision Making Model,
Yes.
the NDM, is at the end of the module. It does not appear until page 18
That's correct,
of the
yes.
module. The layout of information in this section does not flow in a logical manner. Below, I have set out a number of issues I have with this section. And I think you have 9 bullet points, issues that you raise in relation to Module 1.
Yes.
And I'd like to go through these with you. And I think you name issues with about 7 of the different aspects. So let's start at section 1. So bullet point 1, module 1, section 1 at page 2. Learning outcome, bullet point 2, this is misleading as a risk assessment is carried out before force might be used. This could lead an officer to believe that force is applied prior to consideration as to its proportionality or suitability in the circumstances. Now I'd like to look at module 1, section 1 at page 2, so that we can actually see what you're referring to here. Perhaps you have a copy of your report in
Yes,
front
I've got
of
my
you,
report
so you can
up,
keep
yeah.
that in front of you. Unfortunately, we can't see everything on the
No,
screen
not
at
a
one
problem.
time.
I've got my report with the bullet points.
Excellent. So if we could look, please, at the 2013 manual again, please. And that's PS 10938. And so if we can look at Module 1. Section 1, page 2. Now this is Module 1, Officer Safety Training, appearing on the screen, and we're going to look at page 2. And you'll see each of these pages have different numbers on the bottom of the... There we are. You see the page number on the bottom
Yes,
left-hand side?
you just need to go up a little bit. So that's the second bullet point. I think.
So let's look at the bullet points there, and it says learning outcomes. So what we have on the screen is the 2013 manual, Module 1, and you have your report in front of you in a hard copy. And you've highlighted an issue with learning outcomes, bullet point 2, which says explain the levels of force that may be used when carrying out a threat assessment. And tell us what your concerns were here.
Well, as a learning outcome, this is what should be achieved by the officer or by the student from the training. The wording of that indicates to me, as a reader, that a level of force is inevitable, and that. But a threat assessment is a process that's carried out before a decision to use force is actually taken. So going back to my my opening paragraph on that, the fact that the model, the NDM, is at the end of the section doesn't lead an officer to a rational process of being able to assess a situation and arrive at a balanced and decision and a tactical option that is going to work to resolve the problem. It starts, and this leads an officer, I think, to actually think that forces are inevitable, and forces, we're only going to talk about situations where force is used, where actually, when we're talking about conflict management, we're talking about trying to deal with situations without reverting to using force and using other options to resolve the problem. So using words like, you know, a level of force, to me, I think is misleading, and it's an unachievable and actually incorrect learning outcome to have at the beginning of training for a student officer.
So let's look at page 18, which is where you've highlighted the NDM appears.
Yeah.
So this is right at the end of Module 1. That's page 10. So this is at the very end of Module 1.
Yes.
National decision-making model, and we've heard evidence about this. This is the process where you're gathering information and assessing the threat and risk and developing a working strategy, consider powers and policy, identify options and contingencies, and those options may or may not include the use of force.
Yes.
They could include options which involve no force whatsoever.
That's correct.
And take action and review what happened. And as additional or new information comes to your attention, you can repeat the cycle.
Yes, you can jump from any of the boxes back to the beginning when further information or intelligence becomes evident. It's not something that you go all the way around and back to the beginning.
So it's not necessary, if using the national decision-making model, to use force
No,
or to even aim to use force in any way.
not at all. The decision, the tactical option may be to stand back and observe. It may be to withdraw. But that's based on the information that you've gathered and the assessment that you've carried out, and you've considered what you can and legally and ethically do before you actually take the action.
But when we go back to page 2 of Module 1 and the learning outcomes, which is what we were on a moment ago, so this is really the page 1 is effectively just the covering sheet.
Yeah.
So it's the first page that a student would look at in Module 1. The learning outcomes, bullet point 2, is about explaining the levels of force that may be used when carrying out a threat assessment.
Yeah.
And so there appears to be a prominence, if I can put it that way, given to the use of force.
There certainly seems to be with that learning outcome, yes.
And your concerns with that were what?
Just the fact that as a second bullet point, I would have said the first learning outcomes from this section should be to be able to understand the sources of information and intelligence that can be used for officers, then how to conduct a risk assessment or a threat assessment, then use of force powers and considerations. So following the model as it is, just going round the process and giving the officers the information and the learning outcomes to understand each section of the model.
And thinking about the impact on someone who's being trained, a probationer or someone else, an officer, you've described that, and the word you use is misleading. And is that the impact you fear could?
Certainly for a new officer, probably not so much in an officer who's already received the training, but certainly for a new officer, I think that leads an individual that there is a requirement for a level of force within this process.
Then can we move to page 3, please, of Module 1? And thank you. And without going to your report, if we can just, you can see what you said. It starts with human rights and use of force. Under the NDM, these are considerations in the third phase after gathering information and assessing the situation.
Yes.
So again, can you explain what your concerns were with page 3 of Module 1?
Well, you're firing the legality as the first element to the student, which it isn't. It's the third consideration after you've gathered the information and you've made that assessment of the risk. Because if that's not conducted, this information is front-loaded and is not really a requirement at that early stage. It's a requirement that you have to bring in into your consideration, your decision-making, once you've assessed the situation. So it just really, I think it just front-loads, or it appears to front-load the technical information far too early within the training, because you want the officers, the students, to understand the process and what's expected of them before you give them the sort of the extra knowledge base.
So this, the focus on this is about the legal requirements when you use force.
Yes.
Let's look again at page 18, which is the national decision-making model. I think it's the next one. And so the national decision-making model starts with gathering information
Yes.
and then assessing the threat and risk and developing what's called a working strategy,
Yes.
and then considering powers and policy. And is that, when you talk about the third phase, is that the third phase?
That is the third phase, and that's
Considering your legal powers.
yeah. So it's a legal powers, and also in relation to policy, you would also look at that point is the ethical side of it. Obviously, the code of ethics is in the centre, and it's an underpinning process for the decision making of officers. So human rights obviously is part of codes of ethics, but it's really put across as part of the considerations, the ethical and legal considerations under powers and policy.
So, although the law is a starting point for lawyers,
Yes.
for an officer, the starting point with the NDM should be gathering information
Yes.
and assessing threat and risk.
Well, they're faced with the situation before they have to consider anything else. So it's dealing with the situation and then the consideration for the legal and ethical requirements based on what they're faced with.
So the first thing in their mind shouldn't be, what's the law about excessive force or use of force, and how do I justify use of force?
It certainly shouldn't be the first thing in their minds, no.
The first thing in their mind, if they're using the NDM, should be gathering information
Yeah,
and telling
and
us.
assessing the risk to them and others.
Thank you. Can we then turn on to page 6, please? Now, this is section 4 of module 1, and you'll see again, without putting your report on the screen, if we can talk through that. So we're looking at page 6. It's the next one. That's lovely, thank you. There we are. So this is page 6 of module 1, section 4, tactical communication. And I think in your report you say it's tactical. This is a tactical option, and that therefore part of the 5th phase of take action and review.
Yes.
But is shown before assessing risk, the 2nd phase.
Yes.
And I'd like to look at this again. Can you help us understand? Let's look first of all at page 50, the NDM model, which is page, I've completely forgotten. 18. There we are. And we're looking now at we'll look in a moment at page 6, which is tactical communication. And you say that's part of the 5th phase. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Where it's take action, it may be considered as part of the working strategy, but the actual application of the option that's chosen to resolve the problem is taken in that 5th phase of take action and review. So that would be when you would use the tactical communication, and then based on the responses from the individual that you're dealing with, you'd then you may have to modify that decision or that tactical option.
So developing a working strategy may be thinking about the options that are open to you.
Yes, you would look at the different options that are open to you, and you'd make a decision.
But the actual implementation of those options, or one of those options, would be at the take action and review stage.
Yeah, some of it would be at the identify options and contingencies, because that's where you'd be looking at the choice of what's available to you, what might work, what might not work, and then you're actually going to apply that tactical option in the last phase, in the 5th phase.
And what's the difference between developing a working strategy and identifying options?
It's developing a working strategy. It's a sort of a compass all for planners, because this is not just a dynamic model, it's a model in relation to decision making in general across the police service. So it's more designed for where you've got the luxury of time and ability to sort of sit down and look at the problem in a longer period of time. It doesn't really come in on a dynamic situation, because it's not something that's going to be available to you in that circumstances.
So on this model, the second phase is the assessing threat and risk and developing the working strategy. And the fifth phase is the take action and review.
Yeah.
And when we were talking about tactical communication, which if we go back to page 6, and we were looking at that, and this is Module 1, Section 4, Tactical Communication, and it talks about components of communication and taking in elements classified as impact factors, warning signs, danger signs. Your report says its tactical communication is actually part of the fifth phase.
Yeah, fourth or fifth, yeah. I mean, it'd be considered in the fourth and implemented in the fifth, yes.
But it's shown in Module 1 before assessing risk, which in the NDM is the second phase.
Yes.
So is it really out of order?
It is. I mean, in reality, this would be after you'd covered the process of conflict management. This would be one of the tactical options that would be available to you. And you would go back, you would have a standalone input on this after officers had got the grasp of how the NDM is applied and how it works. Because it's like everything else, like, you know, using bits of equipment, withdrawing, standing off, tactical communication, moving in and restraining. They're all the tactical options that are available, and that would basically be the remainder of the training that the officers would receive once they'd got their head round how to apply the NDM.
And again, what impact can that have on someone who's being trained?
Again, I think it confuses them, and it doesn't give them a natural process or application of the requirement of conflict management and of decision making, because that should be the cornerstone really of all of the training, and everything else should hang off of that, so that they've got that methodology and that model to hang the training from.
Let's look at page 5, section 3 of module 1, and this relates to specifically to use of force, justification, preclusion. We've talked with a number of witnesses about the legal requirements effectively about this, and then it specifies section 20, the duties on constables and lawful measures and such like. In your report, you say there's no mention of any force used needing to be justifiable in the circumstances, as the officer believed them to be, not just appropriate to the resistance exhibited. This is mentioned under preclusion, but only in relation to consideration of a tactical option that has been ruled out by the officer. Can you explain what you mean by this, please?
Yes, the definition of preclusion here really just
If you move up the page slightly.
is looking at the requirement for an officer to be able to explain why they haven't done something. So again, that preclude, why did you preclude this? However, circumstances that the officers find themselves in is an integral part of justifying any use of force, because if the circumstances as they believed them to be were found to be incorrect, that in itself should not negate the fact that the actions taken were unlawful or excessive. So the circumstances that the officers find themselves in or believe them to be at the time is an integral part of both AHR, human rights requirements, and also general use of force requirements. So, but this doesn't really mention the fact of reasonable in the circumstances or reasonable and necessary and proportionate as per human rights.
And you've said in your report the circumstances of a situation can have a massive bearing on decision making and what force an officer might apply based on those circumstances. I'm reading from your report. An example might be where an officer believes, based on the information they have at that time, that a person may be armed. They use substantial force to subdue the person, but find they are not armed.
Yes, so that they're the circumstances as they believed them to be, would be a relevant part of the consideration as to whether the actions that they took and the force that they used in those circumstances were excessive or reasonable.
Thank you. And then we can move on to section 5 at page 9, and this is under threat assessment. So again, we're still in module 1, section 5, page 9. And there's a section headed threat assessment, and there's a definition of conflict, and you'll see that on the right hand side of the screen. And your report talks about this area and says that a conflict can be described, you're reading out the definition, a conflict can be described as a trial of strength between opposed parties or principles or be at odds with. And you say in your report, I would question the use of this definition, as in my opinion, it points officers to accept that conflict is likely to become a physical act or battle. I accept that conflict is inevitable, but most situations, when dealt with well, end in no physical force being used.
That's correct, yes.
So again, can you expand on this here? So we see the definition of conflict is described as a trial of strength.
Yes, and so anything where you're going to put strength or anything reverting to a physical act or a physical attribute, my personal opinion is that it pushes an officer into the fact that conflict is confrontational, is going to lead to a physical intervention or a physical requirement, whereby conflict in its normal explanation or normal description is basically a disagreement or a difference in opinion or views or approach to a situation, which is a much broader and I think a better explanation as to what conflict actually is.
So conflict does not necessarily have to be a physical matter.
No, conflict doesn't have to be confrontational or lead to a physical requirement of intervention or use of force.
So it doesn't necessarily require use of force, and in the same way as the NDM we've been looking at, the first stage should be gathering information.
Yes.
And assessing.
Yes.
And use of force may be an option, but it should not be at the forefront of your mind.
It should be a consideration when we get to 3 and 4 on the model. Is, you know, what does the law say I can do? What options do I have open to me? But you shouldn't be going into that with a preloaded cognitive process of this is going to be a physical interaction.
So that shouldn't be the way that training is presented to new recruits, probationers, or officers doing refreshing.
Yes, I think that that assessment of threat, that early confrontation or that early conflict definition is leading officers away from the fact that conflict is inevitable. We have conflict in every form of our daily lives. It's how you manage that conflict which is the important thing, not the fact of how strong you are, what physical requirements you have to be able to resolve that conflict.
And use of force shouldn't be an automatic thing. So any training that perhaps suggests that would be misleading to probationers or officers.
Certainly to a student officer, I would think, yes, who've never been in that or possibly not been in those types of situations previously.
And let's look then at page 9. And this is threat assessment. Sorry, I've got the wrong page number here. Page 15.
15.
There we are. And page 15 is Module 1, Section 9, Reasonable Officer Response Options, Levels 1 to 5. We've heard evidence about this
Yes.
throughout the inquiry. What you said in your report is There is no correlation between profiled offender behaviour and what the reasonable officer response might be at each level. It does not indicate that the 5 levels of reasonable officer response options start before subject behaviour. Therefore, there is a reaction by the subject to each level applied. How does or should an officer quantify these levels? The way they are presented, they are just a list with little or no practical application or reference. An example of guidance might be, if you do X and the subject responds with Y, what might you now consider? Now, we've heard evidence in the inquiry about the profiled offender behaviour.
Yes.
And we've heard that there are 6 options. Escalating up a ladder, I think. In fact, I think your evidence was it was a sort of ladder. The reasonable officer response options are only 5.
Yes.
And that there was not a simple line that you could go across
That's
from
correct.
one to the other. And I think the point you're making in your report is there's no correlation between the profiled offender behaviour and what the reasonable officer response might be. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. It doesn't really give an example or a methodology, again, for students to understand how they correlate with each other. If I was to do it in simple terminology, if I have a person in front of me, I turn up in uniform. So the first level that actually has any impact on the situation and on the management of that possible conflict is the level 1, is me turning up in uniform with my equipment, how I present myself non-verbally to that individual. Based on my presence, the person may respond or do something. So they respond to my presence. If I then use a simple command, something like, come here, stand still, show me your hands, and they don't comply, that's then a response to my actions. So it's letting officers understand that each reasonable response is triggered or should be triggered by the actions or the demeanour of the subject, and not something that should just be chosen to deal with what's in front of them. It's a reactive process.
So if we move up the page, we can see level 2, tactical communication, where you're talking about communicating in some way verbally with...
Yeah. And that goes back to the section that we just looked at. So I would expect that now to be, explain what tactical communication is, what options are open tactically, and then you'd look at the appeal processes and different ways that you can try and negotiate and get that individual to comply.
And again, thinking about the impact on an officer, if we go back to page 14, actually, we'll see that the profiled offender behaviour is explained on that page, which we've talked about. The 6 levels are there, and we've looked at that with a number of witnesses. And then if we go on back to 15, we see the reasonable officer response. So they're on pages 14 and 15 for an officer.
Yeah.
But what are your concerns about the impact of the way this is presented to an officer when they're being trained?
I think this should really be sitting within the threat assessment process. So we've covered, this is basically what you're going to hang your assessment of the risk or the threat on, is what is happening, what is the person doing, how are they behaving, how are they presenting themselves, before you then move on to making the decision of what to do. The section in total, as I said at the beginning of that paragraph, is disjointed. It doesn't follow that nice, easy process. This is what you're presented with. What do you think about it? What do you have to consider? What options are open to you? Right, what are you going to do about it? And it is trying to give them that simple, modular approach to making decisions and assessing situations and keeping themselves safe, their colleagues and members of the public, without sort of jumping from bit to bit. I think from, if I was to overview it, I would say it's a section that's been there for some time. The NDM has come along, and basically the NDM has been stuck at the end of the section because that's the simple place to put it, rather than actually incorporating it into the process and showing that that's what everything else should be hanging off, rather than just, here's a model. Because there's two or three other models before that model in this module.
And in fact, you mentioned that at page 16, there is the paradigm of conflict and continuum, the confrontational continuum, and the conflict resolution model on page 17. But we see here these are different models that are also remaining within Module 1
Yeah.
of the manual. And you talk about they can lead to the conflict management model can lead to a rigid approach to the use of force. And I'm interested in your views on the fact that a number of different models of conflict resolution still remain within Module 1. The NDM model is at the end. What impact would that have on
I mean,
an
I think if you bring the model up a little bit more so everybody can see it.
Yeah, begin to go up the page, please. This is a confrontational
Yeah,
continuum.
so again, I'm talking about
bring
confrontation
it up,
rather
please?
than conflict. So we're automatically leading officers into the probability that this is a confrontation, not a conflict situation that can be managed. But it's, you know, in itself, throwing that, I think, at a new officer and getting them to try and understand what it is and what they're expected to do is quite difficult. I think a number of people would look at that and go, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to tell me or what you're expecting me to do based on that. And then going on to the conflict resolution, which is on the next page, this is a model that we was within the rest of the UK was kicked into touch in about 2002. It is a very old model, but it doesn't really guide officers into any particular course of action. What it does is just highlights the correlation between the three things that will go to make that decision possible. So the offender behaviour is important, the impact factors are important, what are they doing, what's happening, which will guide my reasonable officer response. And the way that is sold is the little quadrant that's in the middle is where you should be aiming to go, but there's no real definition on that model to tell you what's in there based on, it just says you consider these three factors, these three areas to arrive at a reasonable solution. So again, as I said, that was sort of removed from the other manuals across the UK some time ago, and was replaced with the conflict management model, which was the predecessor to the NDM before the NDM was produced in 2012. And I've produced a copy of that for the chair for their understanding.
Thank you. So the confrontational continuum, which remained within the 2013 manual, was very complex and perhaps...
Certainly for a student officer, I think it's quite a difficult way to, or a complicated methodology of trying to get what is basically a simple ladder effect of you do this, they do that. Yeah. In response to that, you can do this. In response to that, they might do this.
And then the conflict resolution model, which remained in the 2013 manual, which had been removed from other manuals in other parts of the UK, was a bit simplistic, perhaps?
Yes, and I think it was purely used as a visual key for staff to understand that these three elements all have a bearing on your decision making, and that you're trying to get that sweet spot in the middle of the three circles for your decision.
But the NDM model, which we've looked at on page 18, explains the process that someone should be following.
Yes, and as I said, as of the date of this 2002, we'd already moved over to the conflict management model, which was the predecessor. Virtually, if you look at it, it's a simplified wording version of the NDM, but it was the process was there in relation to how people think and how officers should approach situations.
So in other parts of the UK, were they using the NDM from 2013 in 2015?
Yeah, it was produced in 2012 in the rewrite of the manual that I did before I retired, and it was instigated or implemented across the UK forces 2012, 2013.
And had other methods, such as the conflict resolution model, been removed?
Certainly removed from the MPCC manual, yes.
And why were they removed?
Just the fact that they were found not to be of any assistance and didn't really guide officers in the way that we wanted them to be, understanding the application.
Was there concern about officers finding it confusing with the different models?
Yep, certainly, possibly. I mean, the paradigm has never formed part of UK, across the rest of the UK. From my involvement in officer safety going back to the 90s, it's something I've never seen other than in Scotland. So it's not a model that's used elsewhere, as to the best of my knowledge.
So that's the Paradigms of Conflict, section 10 of module 1.
Yeah.
That's at the top of page 16. So that's only been presented that way in Scotland.
I've only ever seen it in Scottish-related publications. Yes.
Thank you. And let's just deal with the last couple of points you make on module 1. Section 10, page 18, we've dealt with the NDM. And page 19, which we haven't looked at, stage 2 of the NDM. So stage 1 is the gathering intelligence. Stage 2, assess threat and risk and develop a working strategy.
If I could just make a comment on the gathering information, though,
Yes,
please.
let's go back a page,
Just go back a
please.
page.
So that's page 18. This is the NDM.
Again, this doesn't really push officers into all of the areas that they might be able to gather that information or that intelligence from. It doesn't have an emphasis on using their senses, what they can see, what they can hear, etc., which is a major part of gathering information, but also looking at the intelligence side of things. You know, what are they getting told from the area control room? What do they know about the area they're going to? What do they know about the individual that they might be going to deal with? What other similar situations have they? They're all important elements of information that guide the officer's assessment of the risk. So there's not a lot of information in there, I think, in relation to really pushing that importance of that intelligence and information gathering as the key, because the more you know, the better prepared you can be, and really pushing those sources forward.
So for a trainee, a probationer, an officer looking at this page, there's not considerable detail in this page regarding gathering information. No reference to the ACR.
No.
No reference to considering their own experience or experience of other officers.
Which is a very important part of the consideration process.
So that's just not present.
Not that I
there.
can see from there. I mean, it may have formed part of the actual supporting information, but I couldn't find it in any of the lesson plans.
Thank you. Let's look at stage 2 then. And this is assess threat and risk and develop a working strategy. So this page covers stage 2, and stage 2 ends on the left-hand column just before stage 3. If we can just go down to see the bottom, there we are. So stage 2 is on the left-hand side here, and it talks about minimising the risk to the victim, minimising the risk to the public in the immediate area, maximising the safety of unarmed police and staff and specialist officers, minimising the risk to the subject and allowing for detention or arrest of the subject and recovery and preservation of evidence. In your report, you say there is little information on how to actually do this here.
Yes.
And that's the assessing threat and risk and developing a working strategy. Can you talk us through your concerns here?
Further in the section, there's input on relation to levels of risk, impact factors, different types of profile behaviour, warning signs, things like that. This is where that should be, because that's what we're using to conduct the risk assessment or the threat assessment. So we should notify at this section, this is why we do it, which is what they've done. This is how we do it. You're going to assess the individual, you're going to look at the area around you, you're going to look at the location, you're going to look at any objects, so person, object, place. You're going to look at the impact factors of the individual. Are they bigger than me? Are they smaller than me? Are there more of them than there are of us? Things like that. All of these impact factors are what you use to conduct that assessment. And at that point there, that's not really evident. It just tells you the why, which is, I don't disagree with, but it doesn't give you any information as to the how.
So let's look at pages 9 and 10 of Module 1. And I think this is, so these are previous pages, 9 and 10.
Yeah.
And your view is that really some of the information, at least on pages 9 and 10 of Module 1, would be relevant in Stage 2.
Yeah. So there's your threat assessment.
Confrontational considerations. It then goes down preparation for policing, and then gives you colour coding system and threat assessment, conflict. We looked at that a moment ago, and then general. And then if we look onto page 10,
So there's your person, objects, place, and your risk categories. That information really should be where we've just been, because that's the how.
right. And so, just to conclude this part of your report on Module 1, is it fair to say that you have concerns about the order of all of these sections in Module 1?
Yes, I think the way Module 1 is structured, any normal programme would start at the core of policing, which is conflict management. Certainly within the rest of the UK, the occupational standard is called manage conflict, because that's what we do on a daily basis. So it should start with that, and then from that you then go into each of the elements of the national decision model and look at the hows in each of those boxes. So how do we gather information? Where do we gather information from? How do we assess risk? What levels of risk do we accept or not? What powers and policies do I need to consider? So that's your human AHR and your use of force powers. What tactical options are available to me? What happens if I apply this tactical option? Will it work? Won't it work? And having that contingency, that plan B, ready in case it doesn't work.
So not the primary focus on using force and justifying that use of force, but leaving force until effectively the end of that section.
It's one of the considerations that you need to have, but as everything else needs to be in place before you consider the probability or possibility of using physical force. Yes.
So not just the order of pages or that, it's actually more fundamental than...
I think it's certainly a matter of the formatting and the way the information is delivered or appears to be delivered. It's very disjointed, but also the actual, I think the ethos and the underpinning message that's coming from this leads me to believe, as an outside reader, that the decision to use force has already been made. It's how then you look at the justification of that use of force.
Thank you. If you could just give me a moment. I'm going to move on to another section now, if I may.
In that case, I think we'll stop for the coffee break at 20 minutes. Ms Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at criteria number 1 in section 3 and agreed and documented content. And we've just finished looking at the 2013 manual, module 1. And I'd like to move on and look at the instructor's training manual. And this is from 2012. And maybe we could have this on the screen. PS 12330. Now, you deal with this on page 6 of your report, which you have in front of you, paragraphs G and H. And I'd like to take you through this. So we'll see the yellow band on the right-hand side. This is named Officer Safety Training Instructor Manual. So my understanding from previous evidence is that this was available to instructors in the period up to the new manual being created in September of 2013. But the copies of this remained. This was the only instructor manual.
Yes.
And you'll see at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, this was created October 2012. So it was actually created prior to the student manual we've looked at, which was the 2013 manual, and prior to the creation of Police Scotland.
Yes.
So this manual existed at a time when the legacy forces were still in place.
That's correct, but it was produced by the Central College at Tully Island.
Thank you. Let's look first of all at one of the issues that gives rise to in this manual. You give an example from page 254 of the manual. There's 266 pages here. 254, and you note this at paragraph H of your report. You see this document has a comment at the top of page 254 stating, and this is in italics, refer to your own force policy. So you'll see under general guidelines, this section offers guidelines on documenting use of force, but students should be advised to refer to their own force policy.
Yes.
And what's your concern about this manual, if this sort of information was being shared with students?
Again, it normally facilitated that they were going to get different or contradictory training when they returned to force. So that if this was a new student, they're going to be trained centrally at the college. Then go out to their individual legacy forces, and then once there, they were going to probably receive additional training in relation to use of force and possibly different equipment, different tactics or different techniques that may differ or contradict what they'd been given at the Central College.
So if an instructor was using this manual as a guide to the information to share, and given the concerns of Inspector Young, which we touched on before the break, about different legacy forces and different instructors having different materials, different information, would this cause concern to you in relation to what was being taught to officers?
It certainly gives the opportunity and probability, I would suggest, that other techniques or differing approaches to the techniques that they'd been taught within the college were most likely to be implemented once they did their first refreshers, or maybe even before that. I mean, go back a long time, certainly within the UK, there was a similar system where some forces sent their student officers centrally to the predecessor of the College of Policing, the National Police Training as it was then, NPC, and then they would go back to force. Force would then normally train them in whatever specific bit of equipment they had and give them additional training virtually on their return to force before they went out. So it was an old practice that used to happen across the UK prior, I would say, to 2012, because the NPC basically ceased to be in existence from around about 2004.
And was it a concern to you that this document appears to have been in existence at that time and maybe available for use in light of the fact that since the 1st of April 2013, there were no longer any legacy forces.
No, yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that the 2013 student manual does reflect a lot of the content that is in this manual, so it's quite evident that there's been quite a lot of lift across to the new student, or to then the new student manual. But as you say, once I would have expected in 2013, with the creation of the Police Service of Scotland, that there would have been an amalgamation and a reduction of old training materials.
But certainly in relation to this particular page 254, that reference has not been redacted or removed.
Certainly not in 2012, but I say that predates the formation of Police Scotland. So.
Can we look? I won't ask for it to be put on the screen, but if you look at paragraph G on page 6, you mention the manual and you say in most aspects it mirrors what can be found in the 2013 manual.
Yes, it would appear that the 13 was a virtually direct lift.
You say it has little or no differences or additions to enhance trainers' knowledge or aid in delivery or understanding. And I'm interested in that comment, that would you have expected differences or additions for trainers?
I would have expected the trainers to have additional supporting information to help them get certain points across around use of force, powers, medical implications, etc., as well as training tips and competencies in relation to the physical skills. Unfortunately, this particular document that was produced to me was extremely redacted, so it was very difficult to establish whether some of that information was actually incorporated into the manual.
And you have specified, however, at paragraph G, that there were some trainer-related comments that you could find in the instructor's manual, and you've identified 4 areas where you could identify
Yes.
additional trainer and assistance.
Yes.
Apart from that, were you able to find any others?
Not that I could see through the redacted copy, no.
Thank you. Can we move on to your paragraph in your report, J and K? So at the bottom of page 6, you'll see J. And J and K relate to batons. We won't move this on the screen at the moment. And what we'll do is go back to the 2013 manual, please. And I'd like to look at module 8, which is pages 185 and 186. So we're leaving the instructor training manual for the moment, and we're now going back to what was the student training manual, which was the 2013 manual. And if we can look at module 8, pages 185, oh, maybe that's not correct. It says, let's look at page 185. It may be that is, I think there is a difference between the page numbers you've given and the page numbers which are on the PDF on the screen.
If we go back,
So I think we need to go back to the previous module, perhaps. We're certainly looking for the batons. Well, what I might do, rather than
I think that's
looking
actually from
through
the 2012 manual, that reference that I've given there, because I was still discussing what
I think what I'll do is I'll come back to that once I've had a chance to look at it over lunch, and we'll come back to the issue of batons, and I'll move on to lesson plans. And you make a number of comments in your report about lesson plans, and these were, we've heard evidence that these were in addition to the OST manual and information and materials contained in that. And if we heard from Inspector Young on day 71, 23rd of November last year, about lesson plans. And he said lesson plans are documents that outline the format of a lesson, of a course, and how it should be delivered, timings, content, etc. And he said they were in relation to probationer training at Tullyallen. So they're supplementary to the OST manual 2013. And he said that there were no lesson plans for refresher courses, apart from, he thought, one of the legacy forces, Strathclyde, had in the past used lesson plans.
Yep.
So the lesson plans you were provided with were primarily for probationers.
Yes.
And they supplemented the OST manual.
Yes.
You've highlighted a number of lesson plans. Can we look at paragraph F first of all in your report?
Yep.
And that's on page 5. And you talk about two. Let's look at the first one, PS 11464. So these are two examples that you give in the first bullet point there at the bottom of page 5. So this is the first one, and we'll see it's set out as a table, officer safety training, lesson title, holds and restraints, trainer, personal safety trainers, and the students were student officers.
Yes.
That's probationers. And the aim of the lesson is to provide officers with the knowledge, protocols, understanding, skills, attitudes and behaviours in the personal safety manual with regards to holds and restraints. And then the table details intended learning outcomes and what the student should be able to do by the end of the lesson.
That's correct, yes.
And in this particular example, they're expected to understand and demonstrate a number of different aspects of the course.
Yes.
And number 5 is to apply the techniques with reference to the NDM, including the use of force.
Yes.
And then at the bottom it says assumed knowledge, no previous knowledge required, and students' experience. And then if we carry on, we'll just quickly look through this. There's a column for timings,
Yes.
which is not completed. The content is detailed, outcomes are detailed, method and resources, learner activity and assessment. So can you explain to people looking at this on the screen what would be expected with a lesson plan and what use would be made of a lesson plan?
As Inspector Young has referred to, it's the how to do it part for the trainers. It gives them guidance in relation to what needs to be delivered, where they can gain access to reference resources, etc., for that particular lesson, what they should be teaching, but also how they should be teaching it. So specifics around the techniques, safety concerns, any underpinning questions that need to be asked to make sure that the knowledge or the skill has been acquired. The big thing I find with all of these is they're all specifically generic. The big thing, one of the things there is the trainers must be in possession of PPE, PSP manual, but it doesn't give any references as to what or where in the manual the particular skill that they're teaching can be referred to. So they can't go and reference that particular skill set from the manual or prepare themselves to deliver that lesson. The other big thing that's missing from all of these lesson plans is what the actual trainer should be doing. So you have a learner activity, but nowhere on there is there actually a trainer activity, so showing what the trainer should be doing and how they should be doing it. With a generic lesson plan like this, it's very much open to interpretation, and each individual trainer that came in would probably have their own way of getting that particular message across. So the delivery would differ from trainer to trainer, and therefore different students may well get slightly different versions of the hold or the information, supporting information that should go with it.
And so even though there's a particular lesson plan, the one we're looking at now, It may not provide standardisation, consistency in relation to what is actually being taught.
Yeah, lesson plans of this nature wouldn't provide that accuracy of delivery or that overview to make sure that the delivery was the same every single session.
And for those officers doing refresher training, where we've heard from Inspector Young that there are no lesson plans, is that also a concern, the lack of...
Very, very much so. I would either expect central lesson plans to be produced and given out to the instructors or the trainers when they do their course or when they're given the packages, or I would expect the actual trainer to have produced their own lesson plan as to how they intend to achieve the learning outcomes that are set out by the centre. So the first page is great, the first couple of pages has got all the information on there, but it's really the lesson plan is about how do I achieve that? As a trainer, how am I going to achieve that? And if anybody questions how I've done it, where can I reference the resources and the information that I've used to assist me in delivering that lesson?
And for the supervisor or the central department, they would need a lesson plan to work out what was being done.
Certainly central, it's easier for them because they're delivering at the same venue all the time, same lessons. Obviously, out on the ground on the actual different areas, that may differ, and there'll be different trainers coming in to deliver those lessons. So standardisation would be very difficult to achieve.
Thank you. And in terms of improving lesson plans, you've highlighted that there's no reference here to the specific part of the manual that's being taught.
Yes, that's correct. There's no way of quality assuring that that particular lesson is referring to the correct resource material, or that the trainer has actually referred to that or referenced it.
And when you looked at the lesson plans which were provided to you from the inquiry, were you satisfied that the lesson plans for probationers covered all of the essentials from the OST manual?
It covered the essentials. They were there, but as I said, as to how they were delivered, they give no direction or information as to how that lesson would be presented to the students.
Thank you. And then if we can look at another example that you refer to, it's PS 11463, and this is a ground defence lesson plan. And you'll see it there on the screen. And again, the first page is similar. Ground defence is the lesson title.
Yep.
To be delivered by personal safety trainers to student officers. Provide officers with the knowledge, protocols, understanding, skills, attitudes and behaviours in the PSM with regarding to the following techniques. It sounds like that's the aim of the lesson is a sort of standard phrase.
A generic aim is quite common on a lesson plan, but it's the actual learning outcomes that are what stipulate what the student will learn.
And those intended learning outcomes are stipulated on page 1, and if we move up the page, we see what was expected and what probationers were designed to apply, and indeed again at 6, we see a reference to the national decision model, including the use of force.
Yeah.
So again, there's a reference to the use of force being involved there.
But the one thing that's not on there is there's no reference to the medical implications of the technique, either on behalf of the officer falling or them applying techniques to a subject from the ground.
So hypothetically, if a trainer was looking at this lesson plan, this generic lesson plan, and they wish to follow what is recommended here, they wouldn't necessarily be adding in reference to medical implications.
They wouldn't be not being led to believe that that's a requirement on this particular lesson. There should always be we used to call them golden threads. There should always be a thread of 3 things through all officer safety lesson plans, one being a reference to use of force, one being a reference to the NDM, and the other one being the reference to the medical implications of that application of that particular technique.
And in fact, on the second bullet point on page 6 of your report, you specifically say that no learning outcome listed covers medical implications, and you express the view this should be an integral part of all lesson plans where force may be used. And would that really include any lesson plan then, if we're considering the national decision-making model?
Any lesson plan that's indicative of a physical skill where force is being applied, so restraints, handcuffs, batons, empty hand, defensive tactics, spray, anything like that, we should always have those 3 golden threads, as we used to call them, those 3 learning outcomes on every lesson plan.
That's the national decision-making model, medical outcomes, and what was the third?
Use of force.
Use of force.
Reference and how it fits within the use of force.
And of the lesson plans that you looked at, obviously we can see the NDM is there, we can see a reference to use of force.
Yeah.
Were you able to find any that included medical implications?
Apart from the last one that we just looked at, all of the other ones seem to be lacking that particular learning outcome.
Right, thank you. I'd like to move away from the lesson plans now, please, and turn to the use of force standard operating procedure. And this is something else that you were provided with and you looked at for the purposes of your report. Let's have PS 10933 on the screen. And for your reference, Mr. Graves, on page 7 of your report, the paragraph is L, and this is where you deal with the use of force SOP. And we see here, it's on the screen, we've looked at this with a number of witnesses in the inquiry. Use of force standard operating procedure. This was published on the 26th of August 2013, and this is the SOP that we understand was in place in 2015. So let's look at paragraph L. You've said, not in the SOP, just in terms of your report, and you've said that the SOP contains information from the 2013 manual and other training documents, but the SOP is 84 pages long, and it contains elements that you think you would suggest are standalone items or sit outside the direct application of force by officers, such as PPE, equipment, and training. Mm-hmm. And you've said an SOP would normally give policy and strategic overview and point staff to their training, or where reference to any specific information or activity is needed. And you then list 4 areas of issues that you wish to draw to the Chair's attention.
That's correct, yes.
And I'd like to go through these in turn. So the first is section 6, page 14. So the contents are split into sections, and we're looking first of all at section 6, and it's page 14, and it mentions use of force reporting. Section 6, reporting accidents and injuries and use of force.
Yes.
And you've said in your report that the definition does not include the use of handcuffs or restraint-only strikes with a baton or incapacitant use.
Yeah.
The 2015 OST review report, this is the report that was done by Inspector Young.
That's correct, yes.
Mentions disparity and confusion around what should be included and when forms should be completed. The guidance in this document is misleading and would not cover many recognised uses of force that should be recorded, and you specify empty hand strikes, restraints, takedowns, handcuffs and fast straps. And then you mention a form, and I'll come on to the form in a moment, but are these concerns that you have in relation to the use of force SOP?
If we were to take that paragraph 6.2 by its literal definition, it would mean that an awful lot of use of force conducted by officers would go unreported, and there'd be no audit trail of those particular techniques or that force being used.
So 6.2 says use of force is defined as use of the baton to strike an individual or individuals, or the operational discharge of CS incapacitant spray.
Yes.
So there's only two things mentioned there, the baton and the spray, and only a CS spray. And we've heard other evidence that the use of force by a police officer could be from a very gentle taking someone's wrist to applying handcuffs to a full restraint.
Yes.
So what do you think about the definition that's given in 6.2?
It's woefully inadequate. The definition of use of force is exactly that. It's any force applied to an individual. So any physical contact from an officer with a subject may need to be recorded, and majority of forces or majority of organisations will record everything from, as you say, other than possibly what we would class as an escort hold or a come-along hold. Anything above that where a restraint or any application of force by an officer is required would need to be recorded and documented.
And then in the first bullet point in your report, you mention it may be helpful to get a copy of the form 064. Do we see at 6.5 here at the bottom of the screen? There is a form mentioned. Form 064001 has been created to record these instances and will be available on the forms section of the intranet under guidance. Forms must be submitted as soon as reasonably practical after the incident, but no later than the end of the discharging officer's tour of duty. If the officer is unavailable, then a supervisor must arrange its completion. Now, I wonder if you could look for me, please, at PS 11087. And I understand this may be the form. Well, this seems to be about CS PAVA spray or discharge report. I had another reference which may or may not be on the playlist, PERC 04585. So this, at least this form appears to cover CS and PAVA spray.
Yes, which would indicate half of that definition.
Part of the definition. There is a specific form for that.
Yeah.
We've heard evidence about that.
That would coincide with every other force up and down the country. That's a specific issue. If it's discharged, that would be recorded separately.
We've heard evidence that may be a legal requirement because the discharge of spray is treated as a firearm.
Yeah.
Do we have PERC 04585? We may have to wait for that. Let's see if we can get that, and if there's going to be a slight delay, we can move on to the next bullet point and come back to that other form. Well, what we'll do is we'll move on to the second bullet point that you mentioned. So going back to the use of force SOP for the moment, we can get a hard copy of the form over lunch. Section 7, page 14 of the use of force SOP, and that is PS 10933. There we are. So we're going to page 14, section 7. There we are. Dynamic risk assessment. And you say, we'll see first of all 7.2, the 8 guidelines for conducting dynamic risk assessments are, and then they're listed. And I think we can see duty to remember your duty to protect or preserve human life. That includes your own. Be aware of your physical limits. Tell someone what you are doing or going to do, and try to get support before you do it. Heed information and advice that will help you make a judgment. Then if we can move down the page, see the remaining 5, apply correct procedures in every situation. Record your decision-making process either at the scene or soon afterwards in an official notebook or other recognised journal. 7, your supervisors and managers are there to help you. And 8, making a proper judgment in good faith will not be criticised. So those, if we go to the back, the top of that, just onto the previous page. So we see there the 8 guidelines for conducting dynamic risk assessments. And I think in bullet point 2 in your report, Mr. Graves, you say you're unable to find reference to these 8 guidelines in relation to dynamic risk assessment.
Not within the 2013 manual or any of the other training materials. So, whilst I don't disagree with the statements, they don't seem to form part of the training giving to officers. So, where the relevance would be from those 8 points referring to how to conduct a dynamic risk assessment.
So these 8 guidelines, presumably designed to help officers, are within the use of force SOP, but you could not find them anywhere in the OST manual 2013.
Don't seem to form part of the training in relation to dynamic risk assessment, no.
And what impact could that have on a probationer who is being trained about dynamic risk assessments and what to do?
Well, when you consider the part 3 of the NDM to consider powers and policies, this would relate to policies. So first of all, as I said, it's a massive document with a lot of information, a lot of it stuff that really that officer doesn't really need to be aware of. And now you have additional information that isn't in their, or hasn't formed part of their direct training, as far as I can establish from the training materials produced.
And would it help officers who are expected to carry out dynamic risk assessments? Would it help them to know about these 8 guidelines? And these...
I would suggest so. Yes, it certainly gives them a grounding in the rationale of senior management in relation to what's expected.
All right, thank you. Let's look at the 3rd bullet point. Pages 31 to 66 of the use of force SOP. Now, I'm not going to take you through every single one of them, but if we start at page 31, and we see C Division Appendix A. So 31 to 66 are effectively pages that cover the appendices.
Yes.
Pages appendices A to H. And as we can see from Appendix A, which is on the screen, this relates to C Division. So each appendix relates to a different division.
That's correct, yes.
And if we look at, as an example, handcuffs. So this relates to Appendix A, C Division, and their advice on handcuffs. The former Central Scotland Police issue TCH and Hyatt rigid handcuffs.
Yes.
So they appear to have rigid handcuffs in C Division, and they then give some information about rigid handcuffs and how they're used. But then if we look at Appendix B, which is the next one, and this should be V Division. Sorry, I don't have the number in front of me, it's just the next next one down. Here we are, Appendix B, V Division, and what they say in relation to handcuffs is that B Division, the former Dumfries and Galloway police issue quick cuffs, though they seem to have completely separate equipment from the earlier Division C division?
That was the sort of across the various appendices. There were variation in equipment and also approaches. So rather than be a standard operating procedure that should pull everything together for the service, it was obvious through this that there was still differences between the old legacy forces, or now the new divisions as were, and that hadn't been addressed between the formation in April of Police Scotland and this standing operating procedure being published in September of that year.
So this is, I'm picking out one example.
Yes, there are a number
this-
of examples across all the divisions.
And again, were you concerned about that lack of consistency?
I was surprised that having been amalgamated into one force area, that these differences and variations in equipment and approach hadn't been flagged at a strategic level, and that they hadn't been addressed and a decision made by the senior management in relation to equipment and procedures for the force as a whole.
And what impact could that potentially have in relation to the training that was provided to probationers who may have been going to all different areas?
Yes, again, as I said, I think it refers back to that comment at the top of the 2012 manual, is the fact that they were going to possibly get a particular set of instructions within the college, and then would need additional or variation of training when they approached or ended up on their particular area.
And what potential problems could that give rise to for those
A difference of
probationers?
approaches, difference in suitability of equipment, certainly with regards to CS and PAVA, mixing those two particular substances on some occasions, understanding the rationale of the use of both of those, and also the limitations of both bits of equipment. So yeah, a number of issues that could have caused problems, not least possibly cross-border. I'm sure there's lots of opportunity and lots of occasions where officers from one division may stray across and assist officers from another division. So then again, you've got officers turning up with different approaches, different equipment, and different ways of dealing with things.
We've heard about something called mutual aid. Is that the type of thing that officers can be moved around?
This could just be on a day-to-day. Mutual aid, obviously, yes. You could have somebody from Edinburgh going over to Glasgow to cover a football match or a demonstration, but this could be something as little as somebody shouting for urgent assistance, and it being just across the the divisional divide, and one division officers may well go across and assist with a call on another division.
Thank you. And then looking at your final bullet point on paragraph L, page 8, pages 83 to 84 show information on target areas.
This was a lift from what we were talking
Is this
about
from-
earlier that you were trying to look for. It's lifted into this document.
All right, oh, thank you. I think this is Appendix N for November. So it's pages 83 to 84. Here we are. Appendix N, target areas. So again, on the screen, we're still on the use of force SOP.
Yes.
And you said in your report they only mentioned two options, primary and secondary. Now we see at the top of the screen, it's talking about the use of the baton is closely related to the officer's ability to identify a target of choice with reference to the possible injury potential to any subject's body. A system of identifying injury potential to various parts of the body has been developed and has been divided into two sections. Primary areas, minimum level of injury potential. Secondary areas, moderate to highest level of injury potential. And let's move on to the next page, page 84, and we see an image of front and rear of escalation of trauma chart, and it's divided into front and back and green and red colours. We see if we move up the page, we can see, keep going please, green areas are the primary target areas and red areas are the secondary target areas. Now, if we go back briefly to page 83, we see primary target areas. I think the word used was minimal.
Yes.
But let me just check that. If we can keep going, please, to the top. Minimum level of injury potential. And secondary was moderate to highest.
Yes.
Let's look at the colour images again, please. And you've said here, so the green is the minimum and the red is the moderate to highest.
Yes.
And you say here in your report, there's only two options, primary and secondary. If force was applied to some primary target areas, so the red, more serious injuries could occur. Primary was minimum. Green. Sorry, that was my mistake. And it was going so well there.
Yeah. So if you go to the page before that, which is actually lists some of the target areas under primary. So these can be described as areas where the force used is not intended to likely to cause a serious injury. However, if you look at the target areas, collarbone, shoulder, forearm, thigh, knee joint, shoulder blade, I would suggest that a baton strike to any of those areas has a great potential to cause a break or a fracture. Therefore, I would suggest that would be a serious injury rather than a primary target with minimum injury potential. And also with secondary targets, there's no discussion within this particular advice or guidance in relation to possible fatalities or causing death by the strike to that particular part of the body.
It talks about these can be described, these secondary targets, as areas of the body where there is a greater likelihood of lasting trauma or danger to life.
Yes, I mean, this was something that was changed certainly from the medical review that took place within the UK by the medical advisory panel. They looked at the colour chart being used by some forces and basically changed it to a 3-tier system whereby there was green, amber and red, and a lot of the joint areas, knees, elbows, shoulder blades, etc., were all changed to yellow as a result of their medical advice and to assist officers in gauging the injury potential of strikes to those particular parts of the body.
And so looking at the information which is contained within this use of force SOP, which only gives two areas, two colours, primary and secondary targets, what were your concerns?
I think a number of the primary targets shouldn't be identified as primary targets. They have a greater injury potential if struck, and also the secondary targets, the sort of the red areas as they would call them, the secondary targets. There are far more, I think, than are actually shown. I think it should be a wider broach of target areas for that. So basically, the colour coding is very generic and doesn't cover all of the injury potentials possibilities from strikes to those parts of the body.
And in terms of the information as it appears in this SOP, what concerns do you have about how that's being communicated to probationers or officers who are perhaps checking the SOP, who are maybe doing refresher training?
Yeah, again, as the contradiction between this and really understanding what a standard operating procedure is. It shouldn't go into the training, and this SOP very much does. It lifts an awful lot of the supposed training from the manual, whereby as a strategic document, it doesn't need to do any of that. It should just tell the officer what is expected of them and then refer them to the relevant resource or training program that will give them the information to be able to apply what the senior management require from that operating procedure.
So training should be in the manual?
Yes.
And policy and requirements of the officer should be in the SOP?
That's correct, yes.
And what appears to be, from your concerns, as I understand them, is that training has been incorporated into this SOP?
An awful lot has been lifted from training documents and training materials into what is a standing operating procedure, yes.
And so in terms of delivering that training to probationers and providing those explanations, are you able to help us in how that information would be shared with probationers? for
They
example?
may be informed to read the standing operating procedure or be made aware of the standing operating procedure, and then they may well be required to, do their own learning and read through it. I doubt very much that this is used as a training document, because it's not referenced in any of the materials that I've seen, and it's not something that would normally happen. You wouldn't normally include standing operating procedures. You'd mention it possibly through the training to explain that there is one, and that officers need to make themselves aware of the content of that operating procedure.
But in terms of efficiency and providing consistent and thorough training, would you have any views on whether it's better to have that in the manual?
I think it should all be in the you mean the SOP in the manual?
No, the training elements of that appear in this SOP, should they be in the manual?
There should be a distinct separation between the two. Standing operating procedure is exactly that, is what is expected of you, what are you expected to do, and then what you should do should be elsewhere. It should be within your training and your reference documents that you've been given as part of that.
And then there's one other aspect that you mention in your report, and that's if we look at the images again, we can see that there appear to be numbers on each image identifying different body parts. And as you point out in your report, the body diagram shows numbers, but they're not explained or listed in the document.
Yeah, I can't say any reference, certainly not in that document, and there doesn't seem to be a numbered system within the training manuals in relation to what they are. I would surmise there's a list of the body parts that they've put above, listed and numbered somewhere, but I couldn't find it within the training materials. But that's, as I say, because it's obviously been a straight lift from the training manual, I haven't lifted all of the information as it's been presented in that manual.
But in any event, you couldn't find it in the training materials or in the SOP?
No.
Right. Thank you. Can I move on now and leave the SOP to one side and move on to spells training? Now, I think you deal with this on page 7 of your report, and I'd like us to have on the screen PS 12313. So we see this spells is Scottish Police Emergency Life Support.
Yes, their first aid training package.
Is first aid training
Yes.
for officers. And we understand from this document that it's 22 pages long, and it's dated the 25th of February 2014. So it's the year before the incident that we're dealing with. And I think you highlight in paragraph M of your report, the spells notes have information on positional asphyxia at pages 14 and 15.
Yes.
And if we could maybe turn to pages 14 and 15, please. And if we can move down the page. And we see the topic positional asphyxia at the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
A potential problem that can occur in detainees is positional asphyxia. The death of persons in custody have been attributed to this condition. In otherwise healthy individuals, it can occur when an individual is held down or placed in a prone, face-down position. Although instances are comparatively rare, risks may be increased where the detainee is obese, drugged, or intoxicated. And then it moves on to the next page. Most recent medical opinion suggests that it is restraint and the exertion against such restraint that may result in death, rather than the casualty's position. Some doctors put forward the view that the condition may exist exclusively in intoxicated and obese persons, particularly those persons with a beer belly. The term restraint-associated death, RAD, may give a more accurate description of this condition.
Yeah.
So in terms of positional asphyxia, we can see at the bottom of page 14 and the top of page 15, there are a couple of short paragraphs in relation to that. And this would be part of the spells training
Yes.
that officers would get. Now, I see in your report you've said this information is both inaccurate and misleading.
Yes, if we go to the previous page, please. Just that way there. Yeah, reading that through indicates that it will only occur, is more likely to occur as somebody in a place in a prone or face down position. That is inaccurate. Positional asphyxia, by its very terminology, indicates that due to the position that a person is held in and is unable to escape, asphyxia can occur. So that can be sitting, it can even happen when standing up, or pushed against a wall or pushed against a vehicle. It doesn't have to be in a prone position. So that is misleading to say the fact that it will only or may only occur in a subject that is face down or in the prone position. To say that their instances are comparatively rare, I again would say that it's more common than possibly people imagine. And to say that it's a rare risk, I think it's something that all officers need to be aware of, and it's also something that is given great emphasis throughout the training, certainly from an officer safety perspective, but maybe not so much here within a first aid position. The fact that the risk is increased through obesity, drugged or being intoxicated is correct, but that is not the major impacting factor. The major impacting factor is actually probably partially addressed in the next paragraph at the top of page 15, in the fact that it's about the level of oxygen required against the level of oxygen being able to be taken in by the individual. So exertion is a key factor. So when we talk about restraint death, it's about the length of restraint, the length of exertion, and the level of exertion the person has given. So in all, I think it sort of doesn't fully highlight the risks and fully highlight the dangers and all of the impact factors in relation to positional asphyxia, and to some degree doesn't fully mirror the information held within the OST manual, which is a little bit more in depth. I appreciate it's a different area of training, but I would have expected that the two would have mirrored each other and would have been reflective of the other packages and the other programs being delivered to those officers.
So we've heard evidence that positional asphyxia can cause the death of someone being detained.
Yes.
So the consequences are as serious as they can get.
Yes.
And you've identified here that there is an inconsistency between the OST training in the manual and the spells training.
That's correct.
And then you also highlight that regardless of the source of training here, it does not match what was then being given in the NPCC Officer Safety Manual.
Certainly not within the rest of the UK. The manual had been greatly increased, and the risk factors had been far more prevalent within the manual, certainly across the rest of the UK.
And at this time.
At this time, yeah.
Can we look at that manual just very briefly? It's PS 00073, and we're going to look at Module 4 on page 9. So that's PS 00073. Module 4, this is the Association of Chief Police Officers, medical implications. And if we look at page 9,
You just need to go back one.
go back one. You see, this is talking about positional asphyxia, breathing and the problem of restraint, and there are 2 pages here that we see covering breathing and the problem with restraint, and it's talking about the role of the lungs getting oxygen into the body, and also getting rid of carbon dioxide. It talks about restraint. And it says positional asphyxia. In simple terms, an individual can stop breathing because of the position they have been held in. And it's likely to occur when a subject is in a position that interferes with inhalation and or exhalation and cannot escape from that position.
And that was the agreed definition given to us by the Medical Advisory Board, which as I said had been in place from around about 2007.
So for people officers being trained under this guidance, they won't immediately be taken to the idea that the person would suffer potentially from positional asphyxia if they're prone.
No, it was very much taking them away from that. And the next page following that,
Let's look at the next page.
there is a full guidance on avoiding positional asphyxia, and it covers all the various areas and positions, etc., and the risk factors.
And we see when is it likely to occur. There's some guidance given there. Guidance given about how rapidly it can occur. Risk factors are given. There's a number of bullet points at the bottom left of the screen that include the body position, airway constriction, alcohol or drug intoxication, inability to escape. The subject is prone is a risk factor. Obesity, and it talks about beer bellies there. Restraints, stress, and exhaustion. If we can move up the page, please. Oops. Exhaustion following strenuous muscular activity, such as fighting or running away. And then two furthers, injury or medical conditions.
Yeah, which, again, going back to the spells, I would suggest something like medical conditions would be an ideal opportunity to introduce things that might impair a person's ability, so COPD, asthma, things like that.
So let's go back for a moment just to look at the spells training. PS 12313. And I think we were on pages 14 and 15. At the bottom of that page and the top of 15. And we see there that a potential problem is that for detainees is positional asphyxia. The death of persons have been attributed, and there's mention there of the prone position, and although it's rare, where the detainee is obese, drugged or intoxicated, the risk may be increased.
So it's covering some of the points, but not all of the relevant points. They should be made aware of.
And then the final paragraph, which we see on 15, most recent medical opinion suggests restraint and exertion may result in death. So there's some reference to that there. But as you noted, no real reference to medical conditions or anything of that sort.
Yes.
Right, I would like to go back to, do you remember when we spoke about section 3 in your report? I said there are 7 criteria, and I'm going to take each in turn. And the first criteria was the content, and we've gone through the different materials that were available to train probationers at that time and refreshers. Can we now move on to the second criteria, which is a methodology for delivery with set competencies to measure against. And what I intend to do is to go through that aspect with you. But I wonder, given the time, if that might be an appropriate...
Yes, very well. We'll stop for lunch then instead of 2 o'clock.